gathering off in the right way by acknowledging the people and the land that are being occupied right here and the colonial situation in which we find ourselves. So in order to do that properly, I'd like to bring Tammy Starlight to the stage. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg, everybody. I'm Tammy Starlight with little sleep, and I'm feeling anxious. I feel like a student. I'm from the Pego Nation, which is an Ojibwe nation based out of Manitoba, and I'd like to acknowledge in a good way that this event is taking place on unceded and occupied Coast Salish territory, which includes the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam nations. And when you have to come in a good way, of course, because we're organizing so quickly, we're not going by proper protocol. We don't have some elder here. We're not doing that way, but we will have another rally soon. So with that said, next on our itinerary, I have a statement from Montreal, which was written in the middle of last night. Apparently none of us are sleeping. And I will read it to you. So it's been 100 days today that the Quebec students have stood up to an intention to undermine the right of the poor people to have access to education. We must understand what this intention is and where it comes from, who benefits from this intention. We must put this attack on the working classes' children into perspective by looking at the larger picture of what is taking place across Canada and the world. In the context of a worldwide austerity measures, we are seeing the stripping away of rights and resources from the poor and the marginalized. We must ask ourselves, who benefits from these austerity measures? When we look at the recent laws being passed across the country, we see a steady erosion of people's rights taking place. Here in BC, we recently saw Bill 22 strip our teachers the right to collective bargaining when they stood up for our children's rights to have decent education within the public school system. Will this help create a society where children are treated equally, or it will reinvigorate a class-based system? Will the children of the poor be on equal footing with those graduating from private schools? Why is this tolerated? In Quebec, we recently saw Bill 33 passed, in which being used to erode the rights of construction workers. In Parliament, we see Bills 377, 38, which are blatant attacks on working class and the government's attempt to force a corporate agenda. Now workers are having their EI benefits that paid for stolen by the government. Insultingly, we are being told that they will not qualify for their own money they put into the fund if they do not accept available jobs. Even these jobs are not in their field. Lower paying across the country. What's going on here? We will see laid off BC teachers moving to Nova Scotia to serve Starbucks. I guess I could add my shit, not if I can help it. And that's why we're here, isn't it? And now we must watch our elders who have worked their entire lives building up wealth and this government funneling it away to private corporations. Work another 2 years before receiving their old age security benefits. Definitely. Why do they want to make people work until they're ready to die? Is it reminiscent of the days of the Masters and the Servant Acts? In addition, these bills are stripping the workers of their rights at the phenomenal speed. We see the government working with the Vancouver Board of Trade and the Delta Port to establish a free trade zone in the Canadian soil for the very first time. Mass expansion, privatization of everything. What our neoliberal corporate controlled media calls red tape, how will this affect the rights of people in the Swanson Bay area who will lose their agricultural land and clean air? What does this mean for workers' rights? What precedents does this set? What intention is all of this? Well, What will these erosions of people's rights mean when we consider other mega projects being planned by these corporate-controlled governments? Will we be able to effectively defend our land and our health from Enbridge, Kinder Morgan, Keystone, Pacific Trails, and now Westover to Montreal pipelines? Or will people be forced to compete on a global market of labor? We consider the larger picture when taking place in Canada and the working class, so we begin to understand how it connects the atrocities we see taking place in Quebec, which has brought us all here today. The working class's children are being denied their right to education. Quebec students see the long-term consequences of what may seem like a small increase to the rest of us are used to, the exploitation. They look at what took place in America and Britain, and they look ahead to their future generations. Until the 1960s, before the baby boomers became a potentially revolutionary force, tuition at state universities was free in America. Now it's one of the most expensive, if not the most expensive, tuition in the world. 10 years ago in Britain, tuition was free. Today it's about £17,000. So what we're seeing here is a commodification and increasing unaffordability of education, along with the erosion of people's rights, is all part of the global trend. It is the natural consequence that the capitalist system and those in power try to accumulate more for themselves by engaging in these races to the bottom, which inevitably polarizes the classes by denying the poor their rights and exploiting them. This exploitation can only be successful by the use of force, which is what we are seeing with the draconian measures in Bill 78. As well as the extreme use of violence by the police in Quebec before this law even came to pass. We have seen the state protect corporate interests in the use of violence against free citizens repeatedly. From APEC here to Vancouver, to the WTO in Seattle, and the Third Summit of the Americas in Quebec City, the G8, the G20 in Philadelphia, Toronto, now NATO in Chicago, and many other countless situations. We saw witch hunts for communists in the 30s through the 50s. We saw War Measures Act during the October crisis, and now we're seeing this use of force occur again. However, this time, it's unprecedented. The more people have been arrested in the last 3 months of the student strike than any other mass arrest in Canadian history. Woo! With 400 arrested over this past weekend alone. Dozens of youth have been seriously injured and hospitalized. Some have even lost eyes and ears or had their heads critically injured. I'm talking about permanent, lifelong damage, while the corporate media skews its reporting and focus on windows, since when was a lifeless object more important than somebody's child? Even Amnesty International has come out and expressed concern over the use of violence and chemicals against student protesters in Quebec. This past weekend, we saw riot police pepper spray a group of restaurant patrons who were sitting on a terrace when the protest went by. Not only has the state demonstrated its apathy towards people's right to be free from violence, but this special law 78 has now made it illegal to assemble in groups of more than 9. So apparently we would be very illegal in Quebec. To hold demonstrations without police approval, for demonstrations to come within 50 meters of schools, for people to encourage other people to demonstrate, for professors to strike until 2013 July, lest they be subject to heavy fines which will bankrupt their associations. This is completely unconstitutional and against the democratic principles of which this colony called Canada is supposed to be governed by. It does not just affect the students, rather it affects us all. We cannot allow the disintegration of what little democracy we have left to be tolerated. The battle for youth in Quebec is a battle for all people who desire liberty and believe in freedom. The battle of a class as well. We all learned the class term and we should be no longer shying away from using it. Why have we been taught to believe believe we live in a classless society when it's quite obviously not true. The intention of the neoliberal agenda is clear. They have waged a class war against us. They have stripped the grandchildren of hard-fought one by their previous generations. In order to maintain and gain liberty, we must defend it and never be complacent with it, because we know their intentions. Today we stand in solidarity with the Quebec Student Union movement in Quebec, and who not only knows of the ruling class's intentions, but actively engaged in brutal and uprising resistance to it. They have shown us, the rest of us, that it is possible to defend ourselves in an age when it seems to have forgotten us. And an age when they stare down the barrels of guns and forget that we make them, and that we can stop making them. That we are the ones who in fact are the majority, that we the people no longer need legitimacy to these illegitimate figures and systems that claim authority over us. We stand here inspired by their courage, strength, in the face of fascistic adversity, inspired by their democratic structures and empower people and enable them to act as autonomous, engaged citizens. Inspired because it feels like we are 5 minutes before midnight, like the spark we've been all waiting for is finally about to fall in the dry bush. Inspired and moved, not only to help them as best we can, including hopefully financially, but also remember that where the power lies, and unite and build our own movement here at home. Power to the people. So that was written by one of our organizers who's currently in the 500,000 plus protest rally that's happening in Montreal right now. I don't know if you're watching any of the live feeds, maybe catching some of the corporate media, but I'm beyond inspired by what I've been seeing. As a matter of fact, I'm absolutely an honor to stand here with you all. So certainly, you know, we have it pretty good here, but I mean, until you start really resisting what's happening in this province, then you really feel the brunt of the state on your neck. Because there's lots of people who are feeling that all the time. And I stand in solidarity. All my relations. Thank you.
Thank you, Tammy. I feel like the rain is potentially going to get us down, so we're going to need to intermix some chanting into this. How do you all feel about that? So, you guys know this one? When I say people, you say power. People! Power! People! Power! When I say student, you say power. Student! Power! Student! Power! When I say movement, you say power. Student movement! Power! Movement! Power! When I say not messing up, you say power. Not messing up! Power! Not messing up! Power! Okay, thanks. So next up, we've got Suresh Fernando, who's going to be reading an official statement coming from the class, from one of the main unions that is organizing students in Quebec. So without further ado, please welcome him to the stage.
Thanks everybody. It's great to see so many people here today. It's an important day. I stand here as a citizen of the human race in solidarity with everybody. Okay, this is an urgent appeal to the rest of Canada, and it comes from La Classe, which is the primary organizing body of the Quebec student movement. That's a request for solidarity and support for the legal committee of the class, or La Classe. So let's remember they're going to have specific requests, and that's what this is all about. And it reads, sisters, brothers, we write you during a dark time for democratic, human, and associative rights in Quebec with the following appeal for your help and solidarity. As you have no doubt heard, the government recently enacted legislation that amounts to the single biggest attack on the right to organize and freedom of expression in North America. The War Measures Act in 1970. Arguably, the recent law would unduly criminalize marijuana and citizens, and even the first hearing that the War Measures Act ever could. Among other proposed elements brought forward by this law, any gathering of 50 or more people must submit their plans to the police 8 hours ahead of time and must agree to any changes in the gathering trajectory. Any failure to comply with the stifling of freedom of assembly and association will be met with a fine of up to $5,000 for every participant, $35,000 for someone representing a leadership position, or $125,000 if a union, labor, or student is deemed to be in charge. The participation of any university staff, either support staff or professors, in any student demonstration, even one that follows the police's trajectory and instructions, is equally punishable by these fines. Promoting the violation of any of these prohibitions is considered legally equivalent to having violated them and is equally punishable by these crippling fines. One cannot view this law in isolation. In the past few months, the Quebec student movement, inspired by Occupy, the Indignados of Spain, the students of Chile, and over 50 years of student struggle in Quebec, and presently in North America's forefront of fighting the government's austerity agenda, has been confronted by precedent-shattering judicial and police repression in an attempt to force the end of the strike and our right to organize collectively. Our strike was voted and is re-voted every week in local general assemblies across Quebec. As of May 18, 2012, our committee has documented and is supporting 472 criminal accusations, as well as 1,047 ticket and penal offenses. 1 week in April saw over 600 arrests in 3 days, and those numbers only reflect those charged with an offense, without mentioning the thousands pepper sprayed and tear gassed, clubbed and beaten, detained, and released. It does not mention Francis Grenier, who lost use of most of an eye with a sound grenade, was illegally thrown by... Particular concern for those of us involved in the labor movement is that anti-strike forces have filed injunctions systematically from campus to campus to prevent the enactment of strike mandates. Union democratically voted in General Assembly. Those who defended the strike mandates and enforced the strike are now facing protective court charges and are confronted with potential $50,000 fines and potential prison time. One of our spokespeople,
Get back up here
Metro Blue
so I can do this.
keep your eye on it. Will appear in TNA Superior Court under subject charge for having dared say on May 14th of this year that, quote unquote, I find it legitimate that students go and picket lines to defend their strike. While we fight on principle against the judicialization of a political conflict, we have no choice but to acknowledge that the struggle on the street has been, for many, transformed to the courtroom, and we must act to defend our classmates, our friends, and our families. This defense needs your help, which is really why we're here today. Many students have been denied access to legal aid and to help them defend themselves. While students following the justice and strike have been systematically granted legal aid. While sympathetic the inherent nature of legal system means we are spending large sums of money on defense day by day. In this context, that we appeal to you to help us recover costs. Not only must we help those being abused their lives and facing injunctions undermining their right to associate, but we must now act and make sure that the criminalization
to get us all to get behind a rotting system. A system that's in crisis, a system that can't meet our basic needs. Today, the 100-day strike in Quebec needs to be shut down according to the Charest government. Why? Because it's too much of an inspiration for everyone else in the country. It's too much of an inspiration for everyone else across the world. The plant's ideas, the plant's schemes, the plant's schemes against student threat, against the future, and endless wage exploitation. According to the ruling class, the strike is a steward.
right to free speech and free assembly. Now, democracy. Now, democracy.
If you, your union, or your organization is able to give any amount of financial help, it will make an undeniable difference in our struggle. And we need you to be outpouring support from the labor across with us. The board has been together with these credit Canadian and international sort of solidarity donations. We thank you for adding your organization's support to this pledge. Thank you.
So, in deference to that democratic decision, why don't we continue with that for a moment? What do we want? When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Democracy! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Democracy! When do we want it? Now! So just a couple of announcements. Okay, let's cheer for that. Come on. And also, let's have a hand for the class for bravely standing up to Therese. So, just a couple of announcements before we continue. First of all, we are intending this to be only the first in a long initiative of solidarity with the Quebec student movement. The Quebec students are into the long haul, and we want to be into the long haul too. So if you're interested in signing up to hear more about this and possibly being part of a solidarity working group, we've got people in the front, and I think maybe circulating through the crowd later on, who are going to be collecting names and email addresses. So please, if you're at all interested in this, I would encourage you to do that. Second of all, an announcement for those members of the media who are here. I just wanted to mention that we have two media liaisons. One of them is Tammy, who is awesome, and the other one, who is sort of half a media liaison, is going to be myself, but I would really encourage you to go to Tammy first, because I'm going to be busy with this stuff. So without further ado, to get a little bit more into detail about Bill 78 and the absolutely disgusting nature of it, let's welcome Sydney Hart to the stage. She's going to give us an update on that. Thank you.
It's really beautiful to see many of you here. Recently arrived in Vancouver, in Montreal. So I'm going to read a short text here. Some updates from friends of mine, and just to give a kind of a good perspective on notions of terrorism related to Bill 78. So on Thursday, May 10th, during the morning rush hour in Montreal, a smoke bomb was set off on the underground subway system, causing its complete shutdown and barring commuters from entering for hours. 2 days later, 3 women and a man in their early 20s handed themselves over to police. They were subsequently charged with inciting fear of the terrorist attack, drawing from an anti-terrorist law in the Quebec Criminal Code, prepared in haste after the attacks of 9/11, and which had never been used before. Under Quebec law, the charges can entail more than $5,000 in fines and prison sentences for up to 5 years. Anti-terrorism legislation, based on the justification of oppression and the fear of national security, has forced the extradition of suspected terrorists in Britain under order of the U.S. as only very extremely skim and dubious evidence. The same type of justification has detained U.S. war prisoners from Afghanistan without trial and reduced them to a state of bare life, robbed of their basic human rights. So going back to Montreal, a week after the smoke bombs, on Friday, May 18th, notorious day now, 3 of the 4 suspects were released on bail. But a law more monstrous than the last had already been passed, expanding on the justifications of heavy-handed repression in the face of perceived crisis, withholding freedom of speech under the banner of a right to education, of course with its subordination to demonstrable profit. Justifications to avert crisis through this unconstitutional law also mean a glaring attack on civil and democratic rights, freedom of speech, the right to assemble at more than 50 without 8 hours notice to authorities, to publicly voice dissent, and to encourage others to take part in demonstrations. It weighs off our part in a democratic right alien to governance in shaping a politics which we have no titles to take part in, but in which everyone and anyone should. This is already the form of politics that the 100 Days of Strike in Quebec has performed so beautifully. More than 360 people were arrested last weekend in Montreal following the enforcement of Bill 78. Countless reports of police brutality have surfaced. Thousands have been pepper sprayed, beaten, or intimidated by police. In a single day earlier this month, during protests in Victoriaville, a horrific scene was drawn where two young men suffered major injuries from police excess. Maxence Valade lost use of one eye and nearly lost his life, and Alexandre Allard was propelled into a coma after receiving a plastic bullet in the head. 2 nights ago, 70 protesters, after being forced into a kennel in Montreal, were arrested and detained. Their belongings were taken and all their red sprays were removed. A friend of mine was among them, and while he was in handcuffs, several police officers assaulted him with racist remarks, making unambiguously Asian noises, calling him the son of Kim Jong-il, and threatening to send him back to Korea. This is not the Quebec I recognize. When he resisted, calling on their blatant racism, and just this. So when he resisted, calling on their blatant racism and mentioning his Quebec citizenship, all they could think of doing was applying force to him on his handcuffs. So what my friend's ridiculous association to Kim Jong-il reveals, aside from, of course, grotesque ignorance, are the schizophrenic contradictions in the current government's justification of violence and repression in the face of perceived threats to civil rights. Of these, only a fraction are about to preserve the oligarchy of a government that has made no real concessions to the voice of democracy, to the voice of the student movement or democratic principles since the start of the strike. The threat of democracy in the form of that which curtails the rule of the market is the object of anxiety in Bill 78. And in subordinating basic rights to its attack, it embodies the very fear and instability it hopes to abolish. Bill 78 will take effect until July of next year, of course only months after the next scheduled provincial elections. As with other anti-terrorism laws created in the past decade, they are the opportunity for governments in forever claiming recourse to so-called exceptional laws in managing crisis to show us that their very way of distributing the common good concerns not democracy, but the numbing tactics of management, which organizes relations between individuals in such a way that everyone stays in their place, as opposed to a real politics that should drive us and offer us the potential to reconfigure our relations to each other. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So again, I'm really thankful for the audience for suggesting chants. So, no justice, no peace. Occupy the streets. 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 Woo! Okay, so we're going to make a bit of a transition here. We've been hearing a lot about what's been going on in Quebec. I think it's important, or we think that it's important to remember that a lot of the same policies that are provoking 500,000 people to march in the streets today in Montreal have a lot of continuity with policies here. So we're going to have quite a few really amazing speakers who are awesome activists and advocates for social justice among students from Union State right here in the province. And so to start us off, I'd like to give a warm welcome to the stage to Janelle Robertson of the UBC and the Administrative Coordinator for UBC Social Justice Center. Let's give her a hand.
Can you hear me now? Is that better? right in Quebec. So many of our concerns overlap. In Quebec, students are facing massive tuition fee hikes, a 75% tuition fee increase. Here, the cost of post-secondary education has more than doubled in the past 10 years, and it is continuing to rise yearly. Higher education is increasingly becoming reserved for the needs of society, further constructing barriers to already marginalized persons. So having opportunities to see post-secondary education for most is a reflection of our ability to appeal to norms of society and our socioeconomic status of systemic privilege. The cost of education is an issue of class conflict. For many, academia is a very difficult space to access as it is becoming more and more unaffordable and unattainable due to tuition fees. Student debt in Quebec is growing at an alarming rate. Here, the BC government collects more revenue from tuition fees than corporate income tax. While lobbyists focus on student loans, it does not acknowledge the root of the problem. Our tuition fees are too high. The student president of UBC Alumni Society is currently working towards attaining higher debt ceiling. He is working towards increasing the amount of debt that students can accumulate rather than fighting to lower the cost of post-secondary schooling, rather than fighting for the right to education. The average BC student debt is over $27,000, and the students across Canada owe the federal government $15 billion. The government is profiting off of our debt, especially here in BC, where we have the highest student loan interest rate in Canada. In Quebec, the government placed on students by the academic industrial complex as part of a broader neoliberal economic strategy of privatization that has labor unions up in arms. Here, new privatization laws will make it possible to leave the latest sectors of corporate exploitation and will bring BC's first privately owned and operated prison to Surrey. The academic industrial complex is big business, just like everything else. Students are increasingly becoming seen as a means to bring in revenue rather than playing the role. Students are increasingly seen as means to bring in revenue, playing the role of consumers more so than contributors to higher education. In Quebec, this overall movement towards uncut and unadulterated neoliberal economics has the potential to hand over large portions of the economy to the fossil fuel industry, especially to the North Fracking plant. Here, the provincial government has repeatedly disrespected Aboriginal rights and title on the North Coast in order to bring in mining, pipeline fracking, and oil tankers. The situation here in BC and the situation in Quebec is politically intertwined. As such, we stand in solidarity with them. The policy students in Quebec are resisting are not isolated but are part of a broader neoliberal agenda being carried out by mass police brutality and repression. The Quebec student movement has shown that we are in a moment of crisis. Students in British Columbia will stand united with them in facing that crisis, and by doing so, will transform the world. Vive les étudiants québécois! Vive les étudiants du monde!
Going to steal a next chance from the last time that speech. Vive l'étudiant! Vive l'étudiant! Vive l'étudiant! Vive l'étudiant! Vive l'étudiant! Vive l'étudiant! Okay, no, vive l'étudiant! Woo! Okay, so before we move on, I just have a question. Who here wants me to turn the volume up on this thing? Who here's okay? Okay, we're a little, how about people back there, can you hear? Okay, I guess I'll leave it as it is for now. So our next speaker is Dinesh Nathia from Emily Carr.
Hello. I'd like to begin again by acknowledging that we're gathering on unceded Muslim territory. My name is Dinesh. I'm a recent graduate from American University, where I was involved in student activism for the past 2 years. We're here today in solidarity with the students in Quebec who began a strike 100 days ago in response to crippling tuition fees. In standing in solidarity with students in Quebec, we also have an opportunity to bring awareness to the status of post-secondary education here in British Columbia. In 2002, the Campbell government deregulated tuition fee increases, and over a 3-year period, we saw the average tuition fee double. Students united together and pressured the government, and as a result, a 2% cap on tuition fee increases for domestic students was imposed. While that success has
had an impact on maintaining accessibility of education here in BC, we still face a government who continues to cut funding to education. The government refuses to increase funding for institutions as they continue to grow. As a result, the per capita funding of institutions increases every year, and the cost of running institutions falls to the shoulders of students. Tuition fees continue to increase, and there is no cap on international tuition fee increases. Thus, this disparity between domestic and international students cost of education continues to grow. The cuts to capital funding prevent the maintenance and accessibility of our buildings. Our staff and faculty are overworked and underpaid. In 2004, the BC government cut the provincial grants program, placing BC dead last in access to non-repayable student aid. Combined with the fact that BC has the highest interest rate on student loans at prime plus 2.5%, students are graduating with astronomical debt or having to leave university because of the cost. Those who can't afford their education are paying more for it in the long run through interest rates, and this is unacceptable. This is the problem that students in British Columbia are facing. This is the problem that students in Quebec are facing, and it's the problem that students across Canada are facing. It's not about not having the money to fund education. It's about a government that has lost touch with the priorities of the values of education. Governments that prioritize incarceration over education. Governments that prioritize corporate tax cuts and pipelines over public services. United as a community, we are better equipped to demand change from our provincial government. United as a community, we stand in solidarity with the struggles of our brothers and sisters in other provinces, as students, as laborers, as people. And united across Canada, we have the opportunity to develop a strong voice of change.
Okay, how about this one? First of all, another hand for all of our speakers thus far. Okay, how many of you guys know this one? Education is the right. We will not give up the fight. Education is the right. We will not give up the fight. Education is the right. We will not give up the fight. Okay, so next on our speakers list we have Zachary Crispin, who is the president of the BC chapter of the Canadian Federation of Students. So welcome. Sisters and brothers, we're here today to stand in solidarity with our comrades in Quebec, whose fight began against the massive increase in tuition fees and cuts to education funding, and with Bill 78 has transformed into a fight for the very right to speak with a united voice. We are at the same time sending a message to our own government that tuition fees are a barrier to post-secondary education, that most who do attend class end up with tens of thousands of dollars debt, and that we will not stand by and let education be relegated to a luxury for the wealthy. The strike in Quebec is in its 100th day. 100 days of ridicule and bad faith from the Charest government. 100 days of abuse from the police. 100 days of belittling coverage from corporate media. But more importantly, 100 days of steadfast solidarity, 100 days of unity, and 100 days of resistance to a government that wants to erode valued public services. This is the 100th day of the largest student action in the history of this country, and this is the day of the largest civil disobedience ever in Canada. Regardless of state violence and draconian laws, students and workers are sticking it out together to defend public education. Folks from the media will ask what we think about the student strike in Quebec, here in BC, and we answer that this is the greatest inspiration of the student movement in years. And the strike is an inspiration. Students on campuses across British Columbia are watching what is taking place, and we're taking notes. Here in BC, we have been resisting increases to tuition fees by the BC Liberal government. We held a National Day of Action on February 1st. We've organized actions against high fees and student debt, and we will continue to build up the level of resistance across the province. It is the role of students' unions, the student movement, to fight to eliminate barriers to education. Right now in British Columbia, this means fighting for reduced tuition fees, because tuition fees have tripled in a generation and are still rising. It means fighting for an upfront needs-based grants program, so that low-income students are not saddled with more debt and don't pay more to the government for tuition fees than wealthy students. And we fight for increased funding to post-secondary education, because the ratio of faculty to students in British Columbia has never been higher. It is important that we remain united in our fight with the government, that we keep up solidarity with students in Quebec, but also that we are in solidarity with the workers of British Columbia, the British Columbia Teachers Federation, the British Columbia Service and Employees and Government Employees Union, and the other unions that are currently facing a fight with the BC Liberal government to defend the quality of public services, to defend public education, to defend public health care, and to defend working conditions in British Columbia. It is essential that we be united in this fight. Together, we can achieve victory. Thank you. I said, tell me what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like. I said, tell me what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like. Tell me what democracy sounds like. This is what democracy sounds like. A little louder. Tell me what democracy sounds like. This is what democracy sounds like. Tell me what democracy feels like. This is what democracy feels like. Tell me what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like. Tell me what democracy sounds like. This is what democracy sounds like. Tell me what democracy feels like. This is what democracy feels like. Thank you. Next up, we have Margaret Olasky from SFU, or immediately formerly from SFU.
Hey. So I was recently in Montreal at the beginning of the month just for a couple days, and I mean, you hear the numbers like 5,000 people, 50,000 people, and it doesn't really mean anything, but when you're there and there's just so much energy and so much life, you know that it's a really big thing. And it started, with tuition, and it's still about tuition, but it's also about a lot more. Obviously, we've heard about the repression and the violence and all of that, but I want to help us understand right now just a little bit about how tuition links in with the movement being anti-capitalist, because there's really a really strong sense of anti-capitalism with the chant, with what the French students were writing about and everything. So, as we've heard, the average student debt when someone graduates is $27,000 in this land that we are calling Canada. And that's a lot of money. And amalgamated all together, there's over $20 billion of student debt in this country. So that's actually a huge market. That's the financial market. $20 billion to make interest off of, that's like very attractive for investors. So there's sort of two parts to this tuition issue. On the one hand, it's privatizing education because the cost is put on the individual, right? Instead of education being a public right paid for out of public funds, it's paid for individually. And more of the cost goes on the student. So what happens then? You need to take a loan. You go into debt. You pay your interest. And so it's suddenly this debt that is becoming the central issue. And it creates this market of debt that investors and bankers are profiting off of. And so it's that elite, that economic 1% who is, hand in hand with the government supporting tuition increases so that they can have this debt market. And in the same sort of way that with the 2008 subprime mortgage bubble, right? That debt from people's houses is being packaged and sold and purchased and bought and creating a bubble. A similar sort of thing can happen with student debt. So it's not just about tuition. When you put it into debt and you create, you put it into the neoliberal financial system, what happens is it becomes so much bigger than that, and it is relevant to students across the country and to people who don't want to continue to transfer that money into the hands of the 1%. So it's all about, it's not just about having low tuition, it's about refusing these austerity measures and refusing to transfer public money, through students, through debt, into the hands of the 1% who are going to make interest off of that debt. So it's a really big and powerful thing, and I think the people in Quebec are very obviously aware of what's happening. They're very educated, they're an educated population, and it's important to continue to have that, right? To have accessible, low-cost education, and at the same time to continue to assert that it is a social right and not just a site for profit. It's not just a financial exchange. It's more than that. Solidarity with everyone together.
Thank you, Margaret. And on that note, solidarity! 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 Thank you. Okay, next up, we have a speaker from the Vancouver Renters Union, a newly formed organization that is committed to many of the same values that we are here to stand for today. And I feel like it's very important that we listen to the weight that community organizing and student organizing can make. So without further ado, the one and only Nathan Thompson.
Solidarity with Greece! Good thing the rain went away, but I'll still try to be quick. Louder. This morning, Greg said I'm with the Vancouver Renters Union. This morning, the Vancouver Renters Union had one of our first big public actions. We had a press conference outside of the building on Adirondack, right near Commercial Drive, where renters living in a building owned by multimillionaire Aquilini spoke out about illegal renovations, repairs without permits, and illegal evictions. Some of these illegal and permitless repairs resulted in sending toxic asbestos into the lungs of tenants living in the building, when a simple inspection would have barred the possibility of doing renovations in the building. Basic safety measures would have been covered had the landlord not gone ahead with illegal renovations followed by illegal evictions for some. When I wrote my speech, I realized that asbestos comes from the namesake asbestos, a mining region in South Quebec. Many people might know that 1949 saw the historical strike of the Little Asbestos Factory and a massive prolonged strike that, much like today's strike, was ruled illegal by the government of the day. The strike was a turning point in the historical trajectory of progressive Quebec. Certainly not the history of Trudeau, the history of the Quiet Revolution, and the upsurge of working class militancy in Quebec that comes to define Quebec that we understand Quebec today. And explains, I think it's the only thing that explains the legacy and the reason why students are in the streets today. I make this connection with history to say that if once it was the asbestos fibers of the renters that renters imported from Quebec, now it's the spirit of the asbestos workers that we want to inherit from Quebec, transmitted to us through the Red Square and the striking students. The illegal asbestos strike is a historic moment now being reborn in a new sequence on the streets of Montreal and Quebec. What makes us in the strength of their unity is the strength of our unity. The special law passed on May 18th is an attempt to break up the unity of the Quebec students. And I want to say something really quickly before I close about what the bill exactly is, to be as clear as possible, because the Anglo media has done the best job of explaining the content of the strike, the content of the bill, and why it's so controversial. Bill 78 is above all a strike-breaking legislation. is strike breaking in its purest and simplest form. The strike breaking law states students who cross the picket line are now allowed to be protected by legal injunctions that permit blocking anyone who directly or indirectly contributes to slowing down, degrading, or delaying the delivery of school services. They cannot be fined majorly under Section 15 of the law. What this means simply is that a small minority of people who voted against the strike are now allowed to prevent strike action on campuses. The strike breaking in the simplest sense and the purest sense, it blocks strike action on campuses. To be sure, student unions who voted for the strike should be allowed to strike, but more importantly, by the same token, students who want to be scouts are certainly allowed to disagree with the decision of the student union. They're allowed to disagree with their fellow students. They are allowed to embrace the government tuition increases. They're allowed to be as far as liberals in the province of Quebec. They're allowed to be scouts. But their right to be scouts should not be defended by the right of the police to come on campuses with rubber bullets, pepper spray, batons, and gangs of police officers who don't flinch when the Liberal government of Ontario and ministers call for fascist measures against the students. I'm quoting a liberal who is called openly for a fascist crackdown on the students as Bernard Gay